they do actually believe in the assumption of homology, and they also, prior to that, have the assumption of methodological naturalism. Now, Elliot Sober, who is an atheist, again, evolutionary biologist, if you don't dispute he's an atheist, we can deal with that too. He's an atheist evolutionary biologist. In his book, Evidence and Evolution, which is published by Cambridge University, he says, the idea that humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have independent ancestry because they're so different, they're both naive, because within a probabilistic framework there is no must. And he goes on in that same very book speaking about homology, homoplasy, and the ad hoc rationalizations which do actually exist in the field of evolutionary biology.
You're misquoting Elliot Sober.
Wait, hang on one second. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to show me that scientists don't begin off with the assumption of homology. Don't take a word of a scientist out of context. I want you to show me as a field they don't begin off with the assumption of homology. And two, I want you to show me how it's possible to have a conversation about homology without speaking about the mechanism, because if you can show all the similarities between humans and chimps, humans and pigs, humans and whatever, if there is no mechanism of transformation, all you have is a story. Which is why, and this is the last point I'm going to make, you can try and refute all these points, human-chimp ancestry was something which the ancient Greeks believed in, the ancient Hindus believed in, the Enlightenment Victorian thinkers also believed in, including Darwin and his grandfather. The reason why this idea took off is because Darwin gave a mechanism, the mechanism of natural selection. If the mechanism breaks, or if the mechanism is shown to be insufficient, you cannot claim human-chimp ancestry is true.
Okay.
Because without the mechanism, it's like you have a bridge and you have two foundations, the foundations break and you want to cross the bridge. You cannot. Darwin's theory is not a theory about similarity, it's a theory about natural selection leading A to Z.
Okay, all right, so what Suboor did was totally and utterly misquote Elliot Sober. Okay, so what he said was true, that Elliot Sober says you can't just look at similarities and then derive common ancestry. That's naive, and I agree with that. I agree with that right from the start, right? But what Elliot Sober goes on to say, don't interrupt, what he goes on to say was, and this is a direct quote, you can look this up in that very book, the torpedo shape found in sharks and dolphins does not provide strong evidence for their having common ancestor. Natural selection favours this shape in large aquatic predators, so we'd expect it to be present in modern sharks and dolphins regardless of whether they have a common ancestor. In contrast, the gill slits found on human embryos and in many fish are evidence of a common ancestor precisely because they have no adaptive utility in human embryos. The term vestigial carries the double meaning that Darwin intended. Vestigial traits are useless to the organism and they are vestiges of a bygone age. By recognizing they are useless, we see they provide substantial information about the past. Now this is the point. It's true that you can't just look at similarities and then say, right, that's down to common ancestry, that's homology. You have to do things that are more sophisticated than that. Let me give you another piece of evidence to show you how this is done, okay? So let me go back to my little presentation here, okay? So, let's go to something called amino acid functional.
Wait, hang on. Let's stick to Elliot Sober's point, because I don't want you to make a point and move on.
No, but it's important.
No. Wait. But that's a separate point.
Hang on.
Listen. I'm here all day. Let's deal with that point. How does that undermine?
I'm not here all day.
Well, I am.
Okay.
So how does that undermine the point which I made about him?
Because you misquoted Elliot Sober.
How?
You misquoted him because what Elliot Sober said was you can't just look at similarities and then say, okay, that's down to common ancestry. And I agree with that.
No,
but what he said afterwards was that if you look at similarities in functional things, that might be down to common ancestry, might not be. But if you look at similarities in non-functional things, then you can conclude common ancestry. That's what Elliot Sober says. Elliot Sober is very clear.
Okay,
you can conclude common ancestry,
hang on
and you're quoting him to say that you can't.
It's a really strange situation where somebody says you are misquoting this person, and then when they are explaining how you're misquoting that person, they misquote them themselves.
How did I misquote him?
Here's exactly what Elliot Sober said. He said, the idea that humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, the idea that they must have a common ancestor because they're so similar, and the idea that humans and mushrooms must have independent ancestry because they're so different, both of these are naive because they are based on a probabilistic framework, and within a probabilistic framework there is no must in either case. He is describing homology as an assumption, and that assumption of homology fits into a probabilistic framework which also has other assumptions, such as a mechanism of natural selection, which also has other assumptions such as gradualism and vertical gene transfer and so on and so on. So what I said there, he did not undermine by what he's describing later. Elliot Sober, what he's basically saying is that you cannot claim human-chimp ancestry is true, literally is a must, because it's still based on a probabilistic framework, which is exactly what I was saying.
Okay, let me respond, right? What Sober is saying is that you can't just look at the similarities and conclude common ancestry. I totally agree with that. No one is doing that. Let me show you how we do this, okay? Here's another piece of evidence, okay? This is called amino acid functional redundancy. So if you look at amino acid sequences, right, you can have different amino acid sequences give you the same functional protein. It's a bit like, imagine if you get dealt some cards, right? Imagine you get dealt 4 aces. Okay, I've got a strong hand here, right? Doesn't matter what order the aces are in, does it? Doesn't matter whether you've got the ace of diamonds first or the ace of spades, it makes no difference, right? So similarly, in proteins, you can have different sequences of amino acids give you the same functional protein, okay? So there are proteins called ubiquitous proteins that are shared throughout all living things. So an example is something called cytochrome C, okay? So in cytochrome C, you can have different amino acids and they will have the same function. How do we know this? Because genetic engineers have actually taken the cytochrome C of humans, which has a different amino acid sequence, put it in yeast and found it works just as well, okay? So there's no reason for the amino acid sequence to be the same unless I have common ancestry. So here's a table comparing amino acid sequences, right, of different species. And what you see,
homology.
What you see is that the humans and chimps, the amino acid sequence of cytochrome C is absolutely identical. Not a single difference. Hang on, if you can just not stand on the camera. Yeah. Now, as you go to other species, other mammals, they're pretty similar but not identical. And what evolution would predict is they get less and less similar as you go to less and less related species. So if you go to yeast, you see very little similarity. Hang on, let me finish.
You're making.
Let me finish, right? Now the point, and it's the point that Elliot Sober himself makes, is that if you look at something that's functional, if you just looked at, are the proteins similar? Yes, you cannot derive common ancestry for that because they're functional. But the amino acid sequence is not functional. You can have a huge number of amino acid sequences, right? Now, what's the problem? Suboor says it's based on probabilistic reasoning. That is not even a serious objection because you have to say, what are the probabilities, right? I mean, if you say this thing has 1 in 2 chance and this thing has 1 in a zillion chance, they're not the same, right?
Okay.
Let me finish the point. Right. So what is a probability? This was done. They calculated the probability of this pattern happening if evolution is not true. And what they said was the probability of that happening if evolution is not true is 1 times 10 to the power 93. So when he says it's based off probabilistic,
atoms in the universe.
More than the number of atoms in the universe, right? So when he says it's based off probabilistic reasoning, that's not even a serious objection because the size of those probabilities is so big, you'd have to be crazy not to think that that's true.
Okay, so tell me this.
Yeah.
Since you're saying let's go by probabilities, the first point which I want to highlight here is earlier you were speaking about it being a fact, it being true, and now at least we've evolved in the sense that we're now speaking about a probabilistic framework and we're speaking about assumptions.
It doesn't mean
Well, hey,
So now let's go to
no,
disputes.
no. Okay,
The fact
hang
that
on.
things are probabilistic doesn't mean
I didn't interrupt you for almost like 5 minutes.
All right, sorry.
So let me just deal with some points. So the first point is this. Earlier in the conversation, and we have the video here, you weren't speaking about actual probabilities. You were saying it's true, overwhelming evidence, blah de blah de blah. Okay, now we've got to a point where you're now speaking about a probabilistic framework and you are admitting homology, because when you're speaking about look at this and look at this and look, therefore it's similar, you are basically accepting homology as an assumption within that. Now, when you take a particular quote and you say, look, you have this particular sequence and you have this particular sequence, and the chances of these sequences being converging randomly is this. I want to ask you some questions about this, because I'm pretty sure you are clueless about this. What's the null hypothesis here?
The null hypothesis would be the amino acid sequences would be randomly distributed. So
Here's the point. And this just goes to show how ignorant people like him are. Null hypothesis is that you will have randomness. Why the hell would you have that as a null hypothesis? Because anything is better than that. Anything.
What are you talking
what's your
about?
point?
Wait, hang on a second. Your null hypothesis, if it's randomness and you have something which is similar, anything is going to be better than this.
Okay,
all right, you're not getting it.
Okay, no. The null hypothesis here. Okay, so the hypothesis is that humans and chimps will have a more similar amino acid sequence than humans and dogs, and humans and dogs will have a more similar amino acid sequences than humans and fish, and humans and fish will have a more similar amino acid sequence than humans and yeast, which is what we observe.
Which is
right?
why.
Now, the null hypothesis
I,
is that there's no relationship.
You've spoken for quite a while. Let me speak now. So wait. Let's not speak about dogs and fish. Let's stick to the initial point, which was about the null hypothesis being random.
Yeah.
Okay? I want you to tell me, firstly, this. Why is it random? First point. Secondly, when it comes to two things being anatomically similar, which idiot would come up with an idea that their genetics would not also be similar rather than being random?
Well, okay, all right. First question first, right?
What kind of a thinking is that? That chimp looks similar anatomically to that human compared to those two birds. So I'm going to assume anatomically they're similar, but the null hypothesis, when I'm using the assumption of homology, is that this one is going to be random.
You haven't.
That makes absolutely no point.
That made any sense at all.
You haven't understood the point at all.
One person at a time.
Okay, you haven't understood the point. Right, okay. So let's suppose you look at humans, you look at chimps, and you say they're anatomically similar. So you might say, okay, that might lead me to the hypothesis that they share common ancestry, more recent common ancestry than humans and dogs, right? Then you look at things like the amino acid functional redundancies and you see, does the data confirm the hypothesis or disconfirm the hypothesis? Now, Suboor asked about randomness. If it's the case, there's no reason, if evolution is false, why the relationships couldn't be entirely random. There's no reason for those amino acid sequences to be highly similar if evolution is false.
They look similar, so why wouldn't they be?
Because you've missed the whole point. Amino acid, I'll tell you, you didn't understand at all, right? Because if you change the amino acid sequence, you get the same functional protein. That's why, Suboor. That is the whole point. And that is why the leading scientists in the field say this is spectacular evidence. Okay? Sorry. Right?
You can agree with him, but it doesn't add.
Okay.
Look, truth is not based on consensus, yeah? Let me just make
hang on. I want to address one other point that you made. I want to address another point.
Okay, wait, hang on. Science, wait. So,
okay,
I have something talking on the right. Wait, 1 second, yeah?
Okay.
Let me
someone. Let's not call him a thing. Someone. That would be nice.
Well, actually, according to your worldview, it's all matter anyway, so it doesn't matter.
That doesn't mean that we're not people. Okay.
No, people identity makes no sense under atheism.
Okay.
He is happy with that.
Okay, fine. If he's happy, okay. Let me address the point you said about probability.
Wait, hang on. Hang on, I'm addressing your point.
You made that point, I haven't had a chance to respond.
Okay, sure.
Okay?
But
he said, right, that it's not a fact because it's probabilistic. That is a ludicrous thing to say, and he's contradicting himself. He's contradicting himself. Let me give you a quote that Suboor actually said on his video. Okay? He said on his video about hidden assumptions. Right, let me see if I can dig up the quote. Hang on a sec. Let's find it here. Right, let's get the quote. Right, he said, now he gives an example of a crime being committed, a criminal TV show, and he says this. He says, finally, near the end of the show, they discovered the crucial piece of information that was missing. They have DNA of the intruder who broke into the house and committed the murder, right? Program over. We know for certain that the person committed the murder because we have the key piece of information. That is a level of certainty that Darwinists want us to have when it comes to human-chimp ancestry. Like it's a done deal, guys. So that's a direct quote from Suboor. Okay? Right, now.
wait, hang on.
Hang on, let me finish the point.
I agree with that.
Let me finish the point, please.
But why does that point undermine what I've said?
Let me finish the point. I'll tell you why it does. Because when you get DNA evidence on a crime, what actually happens is they give you what's called the match probability. It's probabilistic. They say the chances of the DNA matching and the criteria in forensics is 1 in a billion. They say, okay, if it's 1 in a billion or more, then it's a match. The DNA is that
Sure,
person.
but what's the null hypothesis here?
So it's still probabilistic. It's still probabilistic. You can't say because it's probabilistic it's not a fact. Okay? This is what happens in all of science. So if Suboor's going to reject evolution, he has to reject pretty much all of science.
Wait, hang on.
Hang on, let me finish.
I never said I reject evolution.
Right. You reject human-chimp common ancestry.
No, yes, I do.
Right?
But I don't reject evolution. There's a difference.
That's not the point we're debating, Suboor, is it?
No, but you said I reject evolution, which I don't.
Well, you reject human-chimp common ancestry. That is the point, right? And you've said that there's a problem that is based on probabilistic reasoning.
You do understand.
Right? But in science in general, this is what we do. When the Higgs was discovered, they said, okay, we've got 5 sigma certainty. What does that mean? It means that when we collect the data, we say the chances of that data happening by pure chance are 1 in 3.5 million. That's what 5 sigma means. And that in physics is considered a discovery. We've done it, right? We've got enough data. There's all of knowledge, all of human knowledge has uncertainty about it, right? All of human knowledge. So whether it's a philosophical argument, whether it's physical theory, whatever, there's always some certain level of uncertainty. In a criminal trial, you don't ask someone to be proven beyond all doubt, but beyond all reasonable doubt, and they're different.
Sure.
Because they get to a point where the level of uncertainty, whilst not zero, is so low that it'd be completely and utterly unreasonable not to follow through on the evidence that you have. And if you get a probability like something like 1 times 10 to the power 93, the level of uncertainty on that is so low that you call it a fact. That's the right thing to do.
Okay, so
That's what atheists do.
wait, one second. If I make up a hypothesis, which is this, I'm going to walk down that road, and when I'm going to walk down that road, hypothesis that I have is that what's the probability of me being hit by lightning in comparison to another null hypothesis? And the null hypothesis is the hypothesis that as I'm walking down that road, I get mugged by Lady Gaga, then Madonna comes and gives me a punch in the face, then birds come and pluck at me and they fly away. According to that ridiculous null hypothesis, the probability of me being hit by lightning is very, very high. So what Phil's done here is a very fantastic thing, which is this. He said that this probability is so improbable that this is going to be the result. He didn't tell us the null hypothesis. So I said to him, what's the null hypothesis? He said random. And then I asked him a follow-up question. If two things look similar, why would you assume that when you look at their genetics, there's going to be randomness as a null hypothesis? So those probabilities that he's coming up with are meaningless. 2, when it comes to his earlier point that he made about Elliot Sober, Elias Sober is a philosopher of biology, and he admits, like all philosophers of biology admit, and maybe Phil, he's supposed to have some sort of contact with scientists, maybe you can bring to me a philosopher of science or an evolutionary biologist who is willing to say, because he's going to be one in a million, who's willing to say scientists don't begin off with the assumption of homology, or that science doesn't begin with a hypothesis, which it actually does. Now, what Phil believes, and this is his deeply held belief, that prior to Darwin, and even up till recently, before we had genetics, all we had was human-chimp similarity, right? Just them looking anatomically similar. Genetics did something amazing. That's what he believes. Now I want to ask Phil.
It's not just genetics, it's also the fossil record as well.
Fine, but we've only spoken about genetics now. Now Phil, I want to ask him in front of everyone. Does he believe genetics changed the conversation on homology?
Well, what I believe is that genetics gave, as the paper in Nature said, spectacular confirmation of human-chimp common ancestry.